mean to say that. So we'll just say familiar faces. The topic tonight, as you may recall, has to do with Black Mexico, the Underground Railroad, the search for freedom, heading south. Now, traditionally, when we talk about the Underground Railroad, and we're also going to talk about a group of Black Mexicans called the Mascogos, we talk about Canada. We got Canada on the mind. But those of you who've been with me a while know that I often say our ancestors went wherever freedom beckoned, wherever freedom beckoned. And in this case, this evening, we will be looking at those Black folk that sought freedom, as the song goes, south of the border, down Mexico way. What we're looking at now, the first image, is that of a portrait of a young Black man smoking by Jose Justo Montiel, 1868, Veracruz, Mexico. Veracruz, we will be mentioning that again because in that general area is an old and well-established Afro-Mexican community. The other thing I wanted to add right at the beginning is the concept of the third route. The third route. For many years, Mexico wanted to project to the world they only had two contributing physical factors that added to its gene pool. And they were the Europeans and the native peoples. But thanks, beginning in the 1960s and 1970s, to the work of scholars and activists, they said, hold on, wait a minute, we've got enough information to add a third route, an African route, to the history of Mexico. And so I hope to present to you some examples of that as well. We're looking at now a copy of a magazine still published by the NAACP. It's called the Crisis Magazine. And here is an article from the 30s or 40s with the title article by a white radical named Carlton Beals. Along with that, of course, we see an article on Harlem employment. Maceo, the Afro-Cuban freedom fighter, the frescoes of Aaron Douglas and Du Bois on the theater and the Negro. But for deep and abiding reasons, it seems as though African Americans have always been interested in the extent of our contributions of African people to Mexico. After all, we share a border, and our history goes back even past the key date 1619. In the 1980s, an African-American photographer named Anthony Gleaton traveled to Mexico and made a photographic record of the Afro-Mexicanos, the Black Mexicans. Again, it's called Mexico Negro and the African Legacy. And again, his name was Anthony Gleaton. There it is on the front. And he was able to find scores of Black Mexicans in the area around Veracruz, and of course, on the other coast, Costa Chica. And so we see they didn't all disappear. One of the other false narratives that was floated officially prior to 1999, when Mexico officially recognized the third route, the African route, in its history, heritage, and culture, was that, well, hey, these Black folk just blended in and they're gone now. But oh no, that was not the case then. It is still not the case today. In fact, we can look at the beginnings of documented African participation in the history of Mexico in events like this, which is the conquest of Mexico City by Cortez. And we know that there were Black soldiers, even Black conquistadors in 1519 in the capture of Mexico City and the sorrowful episodes that occurred after that. Among the Black conquistadors, and this is a list from a journal called The Americas, October 2000, are biographical patterns of selected Black conquistadors. One of them participated in the conquest that I just showed you an image of. His name was Juan Garrido. We believe he was from either Africa directly or Portugal. His places of conquest activity were Mexico, Zacatula, and Baja California. He received manumission and a land within the site of Mexico City. Sebastian Toral, again, another enslaved African who was, yes, because not all the conquistadors were free white men or free Black men. In this case, his places of conquest activity were in the Yucatans, and we'll talk more about the Yucatan. Manumission was his form of compensation, and he did not have to pay the crown anything because he got a tribute exemption. Pedro Fulupo, again, an enslaved African, a formerly enslaved African, Costa Rica. So all throughout Central and South America, we have these Black conquistadors who were able to get land and or freedom, and they form the earliest parts of Mexican history. There are those, of course, who believe that Africans arrived in Mexico long before the period of the conquistadors. And as evidence, we have item one. This is it's a Negroid head. It is pre-Columbian, and it was found in Mexico. Much better known, of course, are the Olmec heads, the Olmec heads. And no, we do not say that the Olmecs, which are considered to be the mother indigenous civilization of Mesoamerica, but what we do say is that the Olmecs sculpted these basalt heads in honor of and recognition of an encounter or series of encounters with an Africoid people. They each weigh several tons. They are found just about where the ocean currents would take people into Mexico from the Atlantic. And some of these heads, and I have pictures of this in my book, Black Explorers, 2300 BC to the present. Several of these Olmec heads are depicted as the brothers wearing dreads. So before we take the route of European and other Mexican scientists and archaeologists who tried to tell us, well, there are babies, that we're looking at babies, to which we reply, well, why would they give babies war helmets? To which we say, well, for those who say, well, no, they're not even real people, they're sort of were jaguars. To which we say, where in Mexico or any place else do we find jaguars that look like African soldiers? So we're still working on that. Others, like Matthew Sterling, a white American historian rather, would acknowledge the clear connections between the physical appearance of these Olmec heads and African people. But turning back to the standard history of the hemisphere, when we look at the explorers for Spain and Portugal, we know that what immediately followed in their wake, in fact, traveling many of the same routes, were the trails of the conquistadors, who would follow in these worn, if you will, ocean ways and establish protectorates that would welcome enslaved Africans and, of course, move to enslave the native populations. It is important that we take a larger look as well. When we look at the population of African descent in Latin America, We're talking about tens of millions of people, even today, who seldom get recognized. A few years ago, when my wife and I were traveling in Brazil and Argentina, we got into a disputation with our guide who wanted to tell us that, well, no, if you see a Black person in Argentina, oh, well, he must come from next door in Brazil, to which I offered a correction, because genetic studies that have occurred in Argentina, by the way, the land of birth of the man called the world's greatest soccer star, Lionel Messi, say that there are, according to the genetics, probably African ancestry in at least 1 million Argentinians. People wondered how we would characterize the turn of the Europeans in Mexico and at the same time acknowledge the third root. And one of the earliest people to do this was the mixed Mexican painter, part African, part European, and of course referring to Diego Rivera. This is one of his takes on the so-called Black heritage or Black legacy. It's colonial domination by Diego Rivera, the famed Mexican painter of the early 20th century. In the foreground, 16th century Spaniards sell enslaved people. Their gangs of yoked Indians pull plows in the middle distance, and in the background, still greater brutalities are depicted. But I want to take you to the far left corner, the far left corner, and I want you to look below the halberd, the tall spiked edge weapon on the left-hand side, and you will see there is a brother depicted in this particular portrait of which gave, of course, Mexico a vibrant culture, which again, from the European root, the indigenous root, and the African root. And so if you see that in the lower left corner, under the halberd, in the far left corner, there's a guy with a helmet on, but next to him, we have an Afro-Mexicano. And he was one of the few, in part, we think, because he shared the heritage that he showed in the middle of the Black legend, the harsh, brutal things that were done to Native people and done to some Africans as well. He wanted to show that we needed to get away from futile attempts to change history, to show that it was so peaceful, so sublime, so pacific, if you will. So traditional history tells us that the earliest Africans to come to Mexico were enslaved. And when we look here, we see from Archaeology Magazine, January, February, this is about 2008 or 9, the first enslaved Africans in Mexico. Details from the lives of 3 young men buried in a 16th century mass grave in Mexico City have finally been brought to light by researchers who conducted isotope, genetic, and osteological analysis of their remains. Most notably, all 3 appear to have been born in West Africa. So that allows us to begin to toss away the narrative that there were no Blacks in Mexico prior to modern times. Most notably, all 3 appear to have been born in West Africa. The men's teeth were filed into shapes similar to those described by contemporaneous European travelers to West Africa, and to dental modifications still performed by some groups in the region today. The skeletons were originally discovered in the 1980s when subway construction revealed a colonial era hospital for indigenous people. We know there were a large number of Africans who were abducted and transported to New Spain, but they did not generally live in Mexico City, says archaeogeneticist Rodrigo Baquera of the Max Planck Institute for the Science of Human History. That's why it's surprising to find these 3 individuals there. The skeletons also show evidence of strenuous physical labor and violent trauma. According to Baquera, the men were likely among the first generation of enslaved Africans brought to coastal Mexico in the 1520s. That's almost a century before 1619 in Jamestown. They may have toiled on a sugar plantation or in a mine before possibly becoming sick during an epidemic, which could explain their presence at the hospital. Isotope analysis of their teeth, which can determine where a person originated and what kind of food they consumed as a child, was consistent with West African ecosystems, and their DNA revealed that all three shared West African ancestry. However, the men weren't related to each other, and the team could not connect them to a specific population. It is possible, Barkera claims, that after the community in Africa was raided, it disappeared from the historical record. Far more Africans arrived in Mexico than has heretofore been acknowledged. And so I take you to an extraordinary article from the Journal of Negro History, April 1967, entitled Negro Resistance to Spanish Rule in Colonial Mexico. And if you will read with me the highlighted area. During the 3 centuries of Spanish rule, more than 200,000 African slaves were brought into Mexico. As early as the second half of the 16th century, the Negro slave population of Mexico exceeded that, bear with me, exceeded that of the Spaniards in the archbishoprics of Mexico, Michoacan, Nueva Galicia, and Tlaxcala, and as late as 1742, Negroes not including Afro-mestizos, persons of mixed African, white, and Indian blood, outnumbered whites 20,131 to 9,814 in New Spain. Now, despite the large number of Africans entering Mexico, by 1793, the Negro race had been reduced to a small number. The famous Baron Alexander von Humboldt noted in 1793 that it appears that in all of New Spain, there are not 6,000 Negroes and not more than 9,000 or 10,000 slaves, of whom the greatest number belong to, here we go, the ports of Acapulco and Veracruz, or the warm regions on the coast. We attribute the falling numbers to what some have called mestizaje, or mixing, that went on in the periods of colonial Mexican history. But even in that case, the centuries of African history that occurred give us several connecting points. And the first, and particularly with respect to resistance, is the gentleman whose picture that you are looking at now. He is known as Yanga. He led one of the earliest rebellions of enslaved Africans in the history of the continent. And as what we see here, the city of Yanga was founded after a group of enslaved Africans led by Gaspar Yanga rebelled against colonial rule. Located in east central Mexico, the city of Yanga is named in honor of Gaspar Yanga, an African who was reportedly born in 1545 and who led the rebellion that led to its founding. Yanga, who was said to be a direct descendant of royalty in either Angola or Gabon, and was captured and sold into slavery in Mexico. Now, as large as his rebellion was, there were other rebellions, certainly in the 1530s, before Yanga showed up. So we want to acknowledge that as well. But as you look at the information that you're reading, we look and we think that Yanga was a member of the Grand tribe, BRAN, of Gabon, and was in fact of royal descent. Now, he was taken prisoner by an enemy tribe and sold to the slave traders who sent him to Mexico, we believe about 1579. Shortly after his arrival, he escaped, taking refuge in the steep mountains of Veracruz. With other escaped, formerly enslaved Africans, they formed free towns called palenques. Palenques. And you will find this throughout this part of South and Central America. These are maroon communities. These are maroon communities. So there are maroon communities. They're called quilombos in Brazil, but you find them all throughout Central and South America. Again, when my wife and I were in Colombia, we met some women who were called palenqueras, and their heritage goes back to these maroon communities in Colombia. But the great thing is they didn't carry a sign. They did not have to advertise who they were. So well known in Colombian society are these Black women that they wore a certain type of dress. And that identified them, along with the fruit they carried in African fashion, balanced on their heads. So that let them know that, again, they didn't have to explain unless they chose to, that they were living representations of an old African past. Palenqueras. The main one that would come to be called Yanga probably had as many as 500 men in there, and they gave the Spanish/Mexican authorities what for? They attacked caravans, they freed enslaved Black folk. And he became a leader due to his strength and his charisma, his wisdom, and his ability. On January 26th, 1609, a large Spanish force was sent against the Palenques, but was repelled by Maroons under Yanga's command. And later that year, Yanga founded the town of San Lorenzo de los Negros in the mountains above Veracruz. In 1932, with the assistance of the Mexican government, the settlement was named Yanga in his honor. So what had been known as St. Lorenzo of the Blacks was named after perhaps its most famous leader in 1932. So the story of Yanga, his courage and steadfastness, is still with us, again, even down to the current day. It becomes sometimes mind-boggling for outsiders to dissect the different ways in which race was categorized in Mexico. What you're looking at here is what's called a casta painting, And here we see the child of an Afro-Mexican and a native person. They were called derisively Zambos in Pintura de Castas in the Latin American colonial period. The synonym for Zambo is Lobo. And of course, those of you that are familiar with Spanish know that Lobo is another name for wolf. So even though they are called derogatory names in Mexican colonial society, what we can say is that it went down to a spangling of races in Mexico, in the Caribbean, and in Central and South America. The combination of race and revolution we see in another kind of Costa painting. And that's what you see here. And again, if folk took time to just analyze these photos, they'd see it's not just white folk and native people, but they're African people here as well. So the Spaniards had run Mexico under the casta system, in which a person's position in the social hierarchy was determined by their ethnic background. Peninsulares were Spaniards which had been born in Spain, and they held the highest rank with access to the best jobs. Next came the Creoles, people of Spanish descent who'd been born in the New World. Mestizos were people of mixed Spanish and indigenous ancestry. Pardos had mixed Spanish, indigenous, and African heritage. Indios was the term used for indigenous Mexicans. Mulattoes was the term used for those of mixed African and European descent. Zambos were of mixed indigenous and African lineage, and the lowest caste of all, enslaved Africans. Those leading the independence movements were mostly from the Creole caste, who resented being looked down upon simply for being born in Central America. They pushed for the dissolution of the casta system, which helped to bring in support from others who were even more oppressed by its racial hierarchy. After independence, which in Mexico was 1821, many of the old prejudices remained, and slavery was not fully abolished in Mexico until 1832, 16 years after the War of Independence ended. After the 1910 revolution, the term mestizo was widely adopted as a form of post-colonial identity all Mexicans could relate to, recognizing the mix of indigenous and European heritage in the country. Notice what I said, brothers and sisters, recognizing the mix of indigenous and European heritage in that country. As an old record used to say, where are we at? Well, again, it's going to take time for the third root to be formally recognized. But since there were clear advantages in colonial Spanish society, colonial Mexican society, to being light, and because of the tendency of Africans to revolt, of Africans joining with native peoples to revolt, being a person of color in colonial Mexico and beyond became a negative. Let's take a look at what I've had highlighted here for you. The Spanish considered persons of African race to be infames de derecho, evil ones, of mala raza, bad race, of mala casta, of bad caste, and to have a subversive influence on the Indians. One viceroy advised his successor that mulattoes and Negro Creoles were naturally arrogant, audacious, and fond of change. Undoubtedly, the Spanish attitude and policy toward the Negro was conditioned by the fear of slave revolts. Cardinal Cisneros expressed the feeling of apprehension toward the Negro slave by asserting, quote, "They, the Negroes, are fit for war, men without honor and faith, capable of treason and vexation, which as they increase infallibly lead to rebellion. For they wish to impose on the Spaniards the same chains which they wear." In order to maintain this casta system, they constructed a complex color bar, linea de color, and a caste system. The specific devices employed to accomplish these purposes. One's position in colonial Mexico was to a considerable degree determined by his color. But there were ways, if you were fortunate enough, to negotiate how your color was perceived. I take you now to the story of Pedro Huizar, who immigrated from Aguas Calientes in central Mexico to San Antonio, Texas, around 1778. He worked there at the Mission San Jose as first a carpenter, then a sculptor, and later as a surveyor. Initially listed as a mulatto in the 1779 census, Huizar, as his status rises, and possibly because he has purchased his whiteness, is listed as Spanish in the census of 1793. So if you had the money, if you knew to whom to appeal, you might be able to get your color legally changed. And it makes you wonder how many Black folk would do that if they could today. But that's a consideration for another time. It does, in fact, point out that one of the other ways that we begin to see a diminution in the presence of Afro-Mexicans beginning 1700s, 1800s, 1900s is because we'll never know how many of them were able to legally buy whiteness. Now, not everybody could. There was another classification in Mexico called retinto, or double dye. I suppose we would say that today as a man or woman who was blue black. Now they could not, in most cases, buy whiteness. But other than instances such as that, if you looked a certain way, if you had the appropriate connections, and if you had the money, you might be able to buy whiteness. And it reminds me of a story in African-American literature, in African-American science fiction, if you will, by a man who was known in the 30s and 40s as a Black conservative, a man whose last name was Schuler. And he wrote a science fiction story called Black No More, in which an mad and evil Black scientist invented a machine into which he pushed Black people so that at the end, when the machine was done with you, you turned out white. Now, it was, in fact, a satire. Again, it's called Black No More, but it speaks to something that still far too many of us appear to want to achieve. We still have far too much skin bleaching going on. And there's plenty of evidence of that, not only in the United States, but outside of the United States, in Africa, on the continent, and in the Caribbean. So we still have work to do, brothers and sisters. But for those who could not or would not change, when they look for routes up in society, just as in the United States, military service was one of them. So brothers and sisters, I share with you this evening an image of the free Black militia of Veracruz and Havana between 1770 and 1776. This was a way to rise in Mexican society, as it has been in American society. Military service, putting your life on the line, as well as preserving your manhood and demonstrating your fitness for citizenship. Here we have a group of phenotypically Africoid drummers in Mexico in 1889. In 1889, and if you can't make out who is who, then start on the far left in the front rank and work to the back and to the right. There was occupations so inimitably connected to Black folk that people accepted the appearance of Africans as drummers, for example, or as mule handlers or muleteers. This is a picture of my wife when we were in Mexico a few years ago, and she is at a Mayan pyramid, a Mayan pyramid. The name of the place is not as well known as Chichen Itza. This is Chacchobin. Chacchobin. One more time. Chacchobin. Chachchoben, in the Yucatan Peninsula. And as I and she went to study, we found about the existence around the same time, the 1600s or 1700s, and in the 1800s, of Black Mexicans from the Yucatan Peninsula who were known as Afro-Yucatecans. 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 They were people of mixed Mayan and African descent that lived in the Yucatan Peninsula. And they often were used by the Spaniards or European Mexicans as mitigators, as middlemen between the Mayans and the Mexicans. This is, we believe, another pyramid at Chakchoban. Uh, they go back to 200 BC and come forward to between 400 and 600 AD. Chakchoban. Chakchoban. African women and their descendants played a major role in the formation of Mexican society. Many of them worked in agriculture, particularly on the sugar plantations that proliferated in states such as Morelos and Veracruz, cutting cane, grinding, and doing other field work. In cities, these women were domestic servants, cooks, nannies, functions closely related to the daily lives of their owners, who were mostly Spanish or Creole. Many African women and their descendants were responsible for the education of the children of their masters, creating relationships of affection and acknowledgement. For the most part, African descendants, once free, worked in the cities of New Spain, occupying various jobs. Many of them became sellers of various commodities in permanent or temporary markets, okay, in Mexico City and other locations. Others worked as cooks or kept restaurants. Others worked as healers, as midwives, or in crafts, often suffering penalties imposed by the Inquisition. Finally, some were employed as auxiliaries in potteries and in clothing and shoe factories. Some managed to get jobs as teachers, while others achieved advantaged economic statuses mainly through marriage. But Mexico could not escape the avaricious and jaundiced eyes of the Americans. And so the Spanish and then the Mexicans clash with white America as white America began to expand, particularly to the south and to the west. So if we take a look here in the middle map, 1551 to 1650, we will see the Spanish, along with the French and English and Dutch, expanding into territory that would be recognized at least by the Spanish and then later by the Mexicans as their own territory. Look at another way, we see what some historians call America's manifest destiny. And we see that the United States is gobbling up the continental United States and other places. We had the Mexican secession, 1848. We had the Texas annexation. We have the Gadsden Purchase. I'll explain some of these to you as we go along. But what it means is that America is, as to use a term that the African kings used, eating the continent. And we have these zones of contact between Africans, Americans, and Mexicans. In this map of the El Camino Real, the Royal Road, we see, based on Native American routes of commerce and built by the Spanish beginning in the 1700s, this Royal Road extended 2,500 miles and was a major thoroughfare of European and American colonization in Texas. At Natchitoches, near the frontier, enslaved Blacks made up 45% of the population as early as 1737. A 1792 census records 247 male mulattoes, 167 female mulattoes, 15 male Negroes, and 19 male Negroes in Spanish Texas, including, among others, free Blacks such as Juan Jose Medina, Juana de Trejo, Francisco Gonzalez, Serafina Rosales, and 13 enslaved African men, women, and children in a little place near the border called Nacogdoches. Number one, for your consideration, I take you to the Yucatan in the lower right-hand corner of your map so that you'll have that as a reference point. Thus far, we've mentioned the Yucatan and we've mentioned Afro-Yucatecans so that you can see where the Yucatan Peninsula is. Also, you may wish to consider, if it looks a little bit familiar, there are a number of tourist attractions on what's called the Mayan coast of Yucatan, which is on the right-hand side of the peninsula. Now, let's go up to the area that I have highlighted with lines. This is the Mexican state, because these political divisions were called states after Mexico took over from Spain post 1821. And we have the Mexican state of Coahuila y Tejas. Well, that's going to become the American state of Texas. That's going to become the American state of Texas. But right now we're looking at the United Mexican States. Some scholars say that in part because they were so heavily influenced by what was happening in the United States, they decided, since they had districts or states, that they would be the United Mexican States. The great Black historian J.A. Rogers called this man the George Washington and Abraham Lincoln of Mexico. But he was not the first president of Mexico. And we would call him probably the second. And Vicente Guerrero became president of Mexico in 1829. He ordered the immediate abolition of slavery and the emancipation of all enslaved people in both the Native American and the United States, and the making of modern Mexico. Vicente Guerrero is described as a mestizo with Negro blood. In an article entitled "The Contributions of Mexico's First Black Indian President" in the March 2001 issue of the Journal of Negro History, author Theodore Vincent notes that Guerrero's African root appears to have come mostly from the future president's father, Pedro, who was in the almost entirely Afro-Mexican profession of mule driver. And I did mention that there were some occupations in which Blacks so heavily predominated that if you did that kind of work, you would be assumed to be a member of it. So here we go. Vicente Guerrero, who has a state of Mexico still named after him, because he was a man of the people. His African heritage made him particularly popular, and not only among the Afro-Mexicans, but it endeared him, along with his indigenous heritage, and he had some European heritage, to the original people of Mexico as well. But he came to the presidency at a dangerous time. Mexico is being pressed by the United States not to give up its slaves, to go along and be controlled by conservatives who wanted the presidency back. They wanted it out of the hands of a man of color. And so, after having been president less than 2 years, he is going to be betrayed by his vice president, and he will be hauled in front of a firing squad and shot. This first Black Indian president of Mexico. And I pause there to explain to you that when people who desired to be president of the country had come along before him, and in some cases after him, they had not been summarily shot by a firing squad. They had been exiled, they had been sent out of the country. But for this man, who seemed to symbolize the very inchoate fears of European Mexicans to be ruled by the ocean of people of color that they controlled, it was too much. They had come too close to the edge of equality. And so they decided to kill this man. Oh, he is not forgotten, as I said today. But for a time, people feared the impact of having a man of the people control the destiny of the country. with the passing of Vicente Guerrero, there is now a, if you will, a political full court press on how much of Mexico can the American slaveocracy control. Let's take a look at this newspaper, the Salt Lake Herald. And even though you'll see the date as 1909, it is a retrospective article on American control of parts of Mexico. And if they cannot get all of it, they at least want Texas. What does Texas mean to the slave owners? Texas is the last great frontier of American slavery as far as the United States went. We're talking about over 200,000 miles in their fever dreams of waving cotton and enslaved Black people. They had no wish to do anything but grease the skids by which Texas could slide right into the American political firmament. They established diplomats whose sole job was to go from Texas to Washington, D.C., to set up the easiest transition of any American state into the Stars and Stripes. What we see in the article, one of the most picturesque figures in American history, an empire by a masterly retreat. We're looking at Jose Lopez de Santa Anna. Between, as the newspaper article says, between the Americans and the Mexicans, there was constant friction. Mexico had freed its slaves and in 1839 tried to extend emancipation to Texas. Mexico, having peons, had no need of Black slaves. Texas had about 1,000 Blacks in slavery. In the struggle between Bustamante and Santa Anna, Texas supported Santa Anna, but when Santa Anna obtained the presidency, Texas was no nearer to its declared desires. Why is this? And does this man's name, General Jose Lopez de Santa Anna, sound familiar? He ought to. That's the Mexican general that attacked and was victorious at a little outpost in Texas called the Alamo. He called the Alamo. And since it is seldom, if ever, spoken of, but was a key factor in American interests in the state of Texas, we're going to at least touch on the issue of slavery. In most American Westerns, the Mexican general, Jose Lopez de Santa Anna, is portrayed as a vain peacock of a man, as well as being incompetent, yet he won the Battle of the Alamo. He, of course, his forces substantially outnumbered the Americans, but the Americans were not there simply to have freedom. I submit for your inspection the movie done in 1960 called The Alamo, starring John Wayne. There's only one Black person in the entire film, and they give him a fictional name because there was nobody like Jethro at the Alamo, no Black man like Jethro at the Alamo, who says at a key point in the film, when he could choose freedom by the Mexicans, he says, well, in the movie, well, don't freedom mean I can do whatever I want to? So I'm going to stay with y'all. He's going to be a good Negro all the way down to his fictional death. And in the film, this is 1960. Think about whatever else is going on in America in 1960, but not in the mind of Hollywood. Near the end of the film, when the Mexican soldiers have reached the walls and they're coming into the huts of the American commanders, there is a scene showing the Black man throwing his arms across Jim Bowie to save old Master's life, which of course never happened in the real Alamo. And yes, there were some Blacks at the Alamo, but you don't see them in Hollywood as a rule. And no Black person gave his life so Old Master could live. Of course, Jim Bowie did not survive the Alamo either. And to some, brought up on mythology, we have the horrible awakening that despite the times that you saw Davy Crockett with his trusty musket Betsy kill all the Mexicans. Nope, that didn't happen either. We have an extraordinary document by an eyewitness, Coronel Enrique de la Pina, who says Crockett surrendered. He was tortured by the Mexican soldiers and he bore his torture manfully. But no, in Walt Disney's version, with a little guy, y'all probably too young, but there used to be a star in Disney named Fess Parker. He played Davy Crockett. My memory still recalls, no, I ain't gonna sing it, don't worry. But he was born on a mountaintop in Tennessee. Green stayed in the land of the free, killed him a bear when he was only 3. That was Davy Crockett. But in his Uncle Walt's version of the Alamo, in John Wayne's version of the Alamo, all of the Americans are heroic. Slavery is not mentioned, when yet that is a cause. But I would have you not believe me. Let us go to the general that led the victorious forces on the Mexican side. Hopefully you'll read it with me. There is a considerable number of slaves in Texas also who have been introduced by their masters under cover of certain questionable contracts, but who, according to our laws, should be free. Shall we permit those wretches to groan in chains any longer in a country whose kind laws protect the liberty of man without distinction of race or color? General Santa Anna, a manifesto at the Villa de Guerrero, February 16th, 1836. So when you're sorting out propaganda from history, consider how General Lopez de Santa Anna is portrayed in most films and what he was really like. He was at least on the side of freedom for all people in Mexico and a large measure of equality as well. Now, the lecture this evening talks about the Underground Railroad. Oh, we cannot say that the exodus to Mexico was as large as that from the US to Canada. We believe that somewhere between 30,000 and 100,000 Black folk took the Freedom Road following the North Star. But those going the southern route, as you see on the map on the left-hand side, we think somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000 Black folk went south to freedom. They took advantage of Mexico. And although they had to cross hundreds of miles of desolate territory, they had to dodge patrols by American slave catchers, many of them made the journey. Again, we believe somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000 took the southern escape. Black people enslaved in the US improvised several routes to Mexico in pursuit of freedom. And remember what I said at the beginning. Our ancestors went anywhere freedom beckoned. If that went into British territory, which around this time had been done away with slavery, our ancestors went to Great Britain. Now, let's take a look at the item on the right-hand side. This is a notice in a Texas newspaper published in 1852, 3 years after Mexico promised that enslaved people who made it across the border would be free. But of course, the white Americans had no intention of making it easy for us to be free. Freedom was apparently for them something left for them, and not for anyone who desired it and was willing to risk their lives for it. in the squeeze on Texas and in the movement to wrest it from Mexico, there was a full-scale political movement called the re-annexation of Texas. From this article, the Republic of Texas that now sues for admission into the American Union skirts on one side of the southern line of the United States and on the other stretches along the expanded frontier of Mexico. The climate of this last named country is the most favorable of the whole globe for the development of the Negro race. Isn't that nice? They are referring to us, of course, not as free people, but enslaved workers. More uniformly mild than the North or West, more salubrious, more positive than Africa, and with a soil more spontaneously productive there and in Central America and in the vast regions further south. The Negro is already a freeman, socially as well as politically, the equal of the white. 9/10 of the population there is made up of colored races. The generals, the congressmen, the presidents are of mixed blood. Let the emancipated Negro find himself on the borders of Mexico and the states beyond, and his fate is no longer doubtful or gloomy. He is near the land of his fellows where equal rights and equal hopes await him and his offspring. Yeah, what they have to do is cross out of American territory. They have to get away from Texas under American control because Texas had made it increasingly difficult for even free blacks born in the state to maintain presence in the state. So this push-pull, this grab between slavery and freedom in Spanish and indeed in Texas and in California is portrayed in this, well, let's call it an op-ed cartoon, where you see a black man in the middle, and you have the British on the right-hand side, comparing it to Canada and freedom. We have straight up top, we have Uncle Sam and the Union, and then of course we have the Spaniards, and they're coveting Texas and California primarily. And despite what you heard about California, California has a slave past as well. It's also the site of the Underground Railroad. The only way you get California as not to have slaves is to overlook the history and periods where slavery was acceptable in California. But again, in that case, you have to know the history. Also, as pressure is put on the residents of California, New Mexico, Arizona, and southern Utah to embrace key parts of the pro-slavery agenda and how the logic of westward expansion shaped Confederate grand strategy during the Civil War and ultimately sowed the seeds of slavery's demise. And here I am quoting from a review of a book called West of Slavery, The Southern Dream of a Transcontinental Empire. Slaveholding prospects in the far West had never appeared brighter. Indeed, the Confederacy's first far West incursion occurred, hear me now, the same day as first Bull Run in Virginia, when Colonel John Baylor and 250 Texans entered the territory of New Mexico. But by March 1865, when Jefferson Davis authorized Baylor to again invade New Mexico, the surrender of Robert E. Lee, 1,800 miles away, finally squelched the South's big dream of a transcontinental confederacy. They never gave up on the dreams of a transcontinental expansion. Dear friends, please understand that. It was going to be slavery now, slavery yesterday, and slavery forever. I know many of you are affected by that. Oh, it's only a heritage, not hate. It is a hateful heritage. And if you look at the desire, there is in the collection of letters of Abraham Lincoln, a letter written by a man named Samuel Glover. For those of you who might wish to look it up online, in the Library of Congress, Papers of Lincoln. And he posits the fact that if pro-slavery should have its way, it will extend and overcome nations that are currently free because of what appeared to be the inexorability of enslavement. So no, they were not going to give up. The power of the slaveocracy must, in their opinion, inexorably expand, at least until it met something stronger than it was, of which a little event called Juneteenth might have something to do with it. But they were never going to voluntarily give up slavery. Again, the book is called West of Slavery, the Southern Dream of a Transcontinental Army. Bear in mind that many plantation owners were not merely reactionary grandees seeking to preserve an antiquated way of life, but rather a proactive coalition of politically savvy, economically astute entrepreneurs envisioning new ways to access global markets with their most exportable commodity, namely cotton. And dare we forget the Southern senator who said that cotton is king. Cotton is king. And they intended for it to stay that way. So in the struggle over the state of Texas, the pro-slavery element, and now that General Vicente Guerrero is dead, they're able to affect what you're looking at. This is a newspaper article from Niles Weekly Register, June 12th, 1830. It shows the grounds on which the Department of Texas has been exempted from the operations of the decree abolishing slavery in the Mexican territories. I don't think I need to explain that to you any further than to say that the best work of Guerrero and the anti-slavery faction in Mexico City is now gone within Texas. Slavery is back, if it had ever disappeared. As we go through the 1830s, and we come up to the 1840s, we now come to the period of the Mexican War, 1846 to 1848. And it says here in the big print, many anti-slavery elements in the North saw it as a naked attempt to win more slave territory. You see, we didn't get all this when we received our public school or private school education. We didn't see how the gears that were causing all of this to happen was a hungering for more territory. As one critic of the day put it, a larger pen to cram slaves in. But more and more Black people are coming south out of the United States, and they're establishing communities that in some cases still exist today in Mexico. And so from a Park Service publication, I give you examples of sites in Mexico as well as Canada associated with the Underground Railroad. Coajimalpa is probably the largest area of Black Mexicans still in Mexico. And all of these places are areas where African Americans settled after leaving the United States or its territories. Santo Domingo, Armenta, El Cerrulo, Corralero, Santiago, Pinotipa, Valero, Trujano, Boca del Rio, Veracruz, and Mexico City. Well, our last subject is a group that is known as the Mascogos. The Mascogos, they are Black Seminoles. They are descendants of people from as far away as Georgia and South Carolina that fled enslavement and fought alongside the Seminoles, and many of whose descendants went with the Seminoles and took shelter at the base of a mountain range, the Sierra Madres, in Mexico, and they're still there today. Now, these are and they go by several names, the military, the Black Seminoles, you can call them that. But as of August of 1870, the first unit of Negro Seminole Indian Scouts was mustered in at Fort Duncan. Why did the Army come and look for these brothers? Because they had established themselves in countless battles alongside their Seminole brothers as indefatigable trackers and warriors. Moreover, being raised in by the generations alongside Native Americans, they knew how Native Americans often thought and acted. And so that made them invaluable allies if they would come over to the United States Army. And in doing so, in serving on the border, at the risk, obviously, of life, they became one of the most decorated small units in American history. In 8 years, they never lost a man in battle. And 4 out of 50 of these Black Seminole Scouts were awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor, then as well as now our nation's highest award for military bravery. I might add that that warrior heritage of the Black Seminoles sort of kicked in a new venue when a few years ago, the first Black Texas Ranger, Lee Young, was a descendant of Black Seminoles. Well, they began to see that the United States could not be reliably depended upon as a haven for these freedom lovers. Remember now, they had fled slavery, many of them in Georgia and South Carolina. Many of them traced their African ancestry back to the Gullah people of South Carolina and the Sea Islands. So they went to the Spanish territories hoping against hope to be free, only to realize that they're going to have to leave there when Florida became part of the United States, a slave-owning part of the United States. And so roughly around the time of the 1840s, 1850s, a group of them go to Mexico at the base of a mountain range, and they set up a community that still exists today. I might add, by the way, that the Negro Seminole Scouts were disbanded in 1914. They never got a true break with the Army. Many promises of food, clothing, and so many other things were never appended to, despite their white commanders writing letters, which we have records of. But they wanted to live in peace. And so we believe, beginning in the late 1840s, certainly no later than 1852, a group of these Black Seminoles went to Mexico, and they established communities. While most slaves escaping the southern states went north, thousands traveled over the Rio Grande to seek refuge in Mexico. One of the leading villages, and where some still are today, the Black Seminoles, known as Mascogos in Mexico, had a well-earned reputation as superb trackers and fighters on foot or on horseback. They gathered and served their dual heritages, again, beginning from the 1830s and 1840s. They existed off of African and Mexican and Native American food. And in a town called El Nacimiento de los Negros, which means literally the birth of the Blacks, they settled. So they were conscious of their roots, proud of who God had made them, and they were able to get along in the main with the native peoples among whom they settled. Today, in the mountains of northern Mexico, about a 2 hours drive south of Eagle Pass, we have descendants of formerly enslaved people. They celebrate Juneteenth, or what they call Dia de los Negros, the Day of the Blacks, for over a century. And what you see in the image that I have in front of you are a painting of Mascogos, a modern day Mascogo in the center, and a sign as you enter the town of Nacimiento Negros Mascogos. So they're still there. The interesting thing is that they sing hymns in English, they speak Spanish, they have some rituals that they still speak in English, but their operative language, the lingua franca, is of course Spanish. And there is one worrisome aspect on the horizon of their existence, is that there are no jobs. And so young people are leaving the base of the mountains and going into Texas and other states along the border. The good news is that there is a community of Mascogos in Bracketville, Texas, and that the folks in Mexico reach out to the folks in Bracketville, which interestingly enough was the site of the filming of much of John Wayne's 1960 movie, The Alamo, ironically enough in Bracketville, Texas. But they are still rooted to Mexico. Many still come back to savor the old stories, to eat the foods with which they were brought up on. And today, as knowledge of their existence spreads around the world, they find that these freedom-loving Black folk, you can find a colony of Black Seminoles on Andros Island in the Bahamas. You can find them in the other parts of the United States. Again, they went anywhere freedom beckoned. Anywhere freedom beckoned. My last image is a rare article mentioning the Afro-Mexicanos and the persistence of African traditions and history along the coast of Mexico. And again, this is Sunday, January 28th. I believe this may be from 2008, but you have the title, African Traditions and History on the Coast of Mexico, and African Roots Still Run Deep for Blacks on Mexican Coast, so that you may look it up for those of you that have an interest. And so you can walk among them. You can speak them. You speak to them. And there's a story about in the Rio Grande, I made my way to a taxi stand to cram into another shared taxi that would take me to the boats. As I walked with the driver to his cab, he smiled down at me. Hermanas, you two could be sisters, pointing back at the taxi stand. There, a Black Mexican woman who was staffing the stall watched me with curiosity. In the Veracruz area, Black Mexicans are often called costeños. But you now know another name for them, the Mascogos. Mascogos. They live on blended African, Seminole, and Christian cultures, traditions, and folkways. It has been my great honor to share this information with you. I want to thank those of you who came out this evening. I'll stop the sharing, and if any of you have questions, I'll be happy to take those questions. Again, my deepest thanks to you for coming out this evening.